Okay, so when we run these tests, we run these tests, we kind of end up with two possible conclusions, but there's actually four possible outcomes because as we think through, we kind of have two possible settings. We could have that our null is true, and then we could have that the null is false and the alternative is true. Like, it's got to be one of those two things. And that happens regardless of what decision we make. And we make our decisions based on samples. And the one thing we know about samples is that samples aren't perfect. So the type of decisions we can make are we reject the null or we fail to reject the null. Okay, so if the null is true, rejecting it would be an error. Okay? And if we fail to reject the null, then our test made the correct decision. And as we say this error is an error due to the fact that samples aren't perfect. There's nothing that the statistician who ran the study did wrong. It's just that when you take a sample, it's possible that the sample leads to an incorrect decision. Now, if the null hypothesis is false, rejecting it is in fact the correct decision. And failing to reject it is the error. And there's a big difference between each of these types of errors. So for this first error that we talked about, which by the way we call a type 1 error, for a type 1 error, you're rejecting you're wrongly concluding the alternative. And for this other one, which we call a type 2 error, you are failing to conclude the alternative when you're supposed to. So, as something to kind of help you guys think this through, when we deal with, say, like a pregnancy test, the null hypothesis would be not pregnant, and the alternative hypothesis would be pregnant. And so as to try to make this meme that I made for you guys kind of make some sense, it's a type 1 error when someone tells a man that they are in fact pregnant because we've rejected the null and concluded they are pregnant when it's not true. And luckily Mr. Wapner and Mrs. Turner were good sports about this. Likewise, a type 2 error would be, well, Mrs. Turner is pregnant and the doctor concluding that she is not pregnant. A type 1 error is when we wrongly reject the null. And a type 2 error is when we wrongly fail to reject the null. One last analogy. In the United States justice system, our null hypothesis is innocent. And our alternative hypothesis is guilty, right? Okay? And notice that there's there's 4 different outcomes of a trial. We let an innocent goes to jail. That would be, we reject their innocence and conclude they're guilty even though they are innocent. So this would be a type 1 error. And likewise, letting a guilty go free would be a type 2 error. So just some different ways for you to visualize how we could have 2 types of errors. So for each of these following, if we want to show that the average describe a type 1 and a type 2 error, before you can do those, these are just also a really good practice for us to practice writing our hypotheses. So if we want to show that the average cost of tuition is less than $28,000, so it's averages, since the claim is strictly less than, it'll go in the alternative, and my null will be greater than or equal to 2,800, or 28,000, excuse me. So my type 1 error would be that we conclude the mean cost of tuition is less than $28,000 per year even though it isn't. So yes, that would be type 1. In type 2, we fail to conclude the mean cost of tuition is less than $28,000 per year. Even though it is. And our hope when we run a study is that we don't commit either of these errors. And again, these errors don't occur because someone made a mistake. They occurred because we're relying on a sample, and samples aren't perfect. All right? So go ahead and pause the video, and I want you guys to try to do the error analysis on the next one. Okay, so go ahead and check your answers here. I do want to point out that for that type 2 error, we never conclude that the null hypothesis is correct, because in general, we never, ever conclude the null hypothesis. We either reject the null hypothesis, and then if that's the case, we conclude the alternative, or we fail to reject the null hypothesis and we don't have enough evidence to conclude the alternative. Usually we have some evidence that the null hypothesis is incorrect. It's just, do we have convincing evidence that it's incorrect? All right, so this should be enough to kind of help you work through what is a type 1 and a type 2 error.